We are joined today by Jerome Glenn. Um, Mr. Jerome Glenn co-founded and directs Millennium Project, a leading global participatory think tank. His work has helped identify the public's roles in preventing deployment of future weapons of mass destruction, and he was instrumental in banning the first space weapon. He has published over 150 future-oriented articles, spoken to 300 plus organizations, written several books, including Future Mind, Linking the Future, and co-author of Space Trek, and is editor of Futures Research Methodology version 3.0. That and other research is available at millennium-project.org. I'll put that link in the chat right now. Thank you so much for taking your time to share your knowledge and experience with us, Mr. Glenn.
Okay, and now for something completely different. this is a much different sort of slant on things. I think that we're relatively aware that the future of the environment is a much more serious issue in the future than it has been in the past. So diplomacy dealing with that has got to be taken more seriously. There are organizations in the UK and the United States that have analyzed what makes countries unstable. And majority of those things coming up tend to be the environment. About half the world fits these categories of being unstable. It doesn't mean half the world's going to go unstable. It just means that they're at risk, so to speak. So one, of course, is the food crisis. The things that make food prices go up are all going up. So even if we have up and down for the next few years, the overall trend goes up, which makes it difficult for poor people. Scarcity issues, shrinking food reserves going on, and decreasing water. So we've got to essentially change our food production system eventually. Water tables are falling on all continents, some as much as 3 meters in some places in India and China, which means one day you put your bucket down there and it's dry, which means you have to migrate. And if you migrate to where people are already living, then there can be an argument. And of course, there's a lot of water pollution, especially in China and India. We've got the energy crisis. Factories in India and China are closed down on certain schedules. They just don't have enough electricity to run their systems. Ocean acidification. This is a bit complex. On climate change, we talk about sea levels going up and temperature changing, and that's in the cards. What's further down in the cards, if we ever get to about 1,000 parts per million, which if we keep our stupidity going on, we may get to around over 100 years from now. But if we do, that means that you don't have enough oxygen in the ocean. And if you don't have enough oxygen in the ocean, that means certain microorganisms that normally would not grow start to grow. And those microorganisms release sulfur dioxide when they die, which can pollute the whole planet and poison the whole planet. That's a longer term issue. So when people talk about existential threats of climate change, ultimately that's what they're talking about. Increasing natural disasters are going on, obviously, with all of that. Population concentrations also imply that the livestock waste also concentrates, which then goes back into your rivers and oceans and the water pollution and so forth. Desertification and failed states. These are most of these things have to do with the environment. And these are the factors that people consider on making states unstable. And then, of course, that also leads to migration because of that. And so when we talk about the Syrian migration and we talk about Ukraine migration, these factors will make that much larger in the future than we have in the past unless we turn things around. Now, China has said, even as far back as over 10 years ago, the previous leader, that they would like to build strategic trust with the militaries. I follow this sort of stuff relatively closely as somebody who's not employed in the DoD or the State Department. And I saw no intelligent response to that request. And I think that there is an area for the militaries to cooperate between the United States and China, and that's environmental security. By environmental security, I'm simply meaning environmental viability for life support. That which threatens life support in the environment is a threat to environmental security, and we are globally growing in that respect. So China and the United States, I think, can collaborate on that. Also, you like to look at the CO2, the greenhouse gas situation. And China and the United States, as you can see, by far are the leaders in that. So they have a moral responsibility to lead. And they have the two biggest economies. So they have the cash, and they got the science, and they got the morality responsibility for this. So there should be a U.S. China Apollo-like land a man on the moon type of goal. And I think that that's the most important thing for the environmental movement to do today. I was hired by the Quakers in 1970, 71 to help organize the environmental movement in New England. So I've been involved in the environmental movement for a long time. So I hope you take seriously the comment that the most important thing for the environmental movement is a U.S.-China Apollo-like goal on climate change. And everything else is secondary. Now, you can fit a lot of stuff underneath that umbrella. For example, some of the factors that make China unstable and why I think they would come into this is that they've got almost all the rivers are polluted. The falling water tables, they've already had migrations, large migrations from one place in China to another because of this. And as you may know, the Himalayan mountain caps are going down, which means that the hydroelectric plants won't be producing as much energy, not to mention water for agriculture. And then this also leads into the soil. The soil then becomes, a lot of it becomes polluted and can't quite, including nuclear waste, by the way, because they don't have neither do we, but they also have let nuclear waste around. So that means that they don't have enough healthy land to produce enough food for them to feed themselves. So that means they got to use their Belt and Road Initiative and all this sort of stuff to get food from the rest of the world. Well, when there's a contradiction between your food and exporting food, that can be a conflict as well. And I just already mentioned about the energy problem. They've got also rich-poor gaps because the ideology says, you know, we're all one big happy family. And then the poor people in the upper half of China saying, no, wait a minute, I see all these rich Chinese running around the world. What happened to us? So there's been a lot of protests. I mean, the numbers of protests are so large, it's hard for me to even believe them. But they're supposedly they're in tens of thousands. I don't know. In any case, the conflict internal to China on the rich-poor gaps is a growing threat to the party in charge. And at the same time, rural people, as they move into the South and to get jobs, they don't get treated as well. There's all kinds of racial, I shouldn't say racial because it's the same race, but there's all kind of prejudice against the rural people in the urban areas that are causing conflicts as well. And then, of course, you got the upper left side, the northwest side, where you got most of the oil, by the way, and that Muslim conflict, and that's a potential civil war percolating at any old time, not to mention all of the incarcerations that are going on. All could increase instability. These are very serious issues for the future of China. So I think that they would welcome the idea of environmental security as the focal point. So when you think about making peace on the planet, I mean, Russia is a big deal right now, but when you look out 100 years, Russia is not a big deal. So if you want to look at long-term peace and safety from nuclear, biological, chemical, and so forth, then you got to talk about China and the United States. Now, one of the advantages of the COVID situation is that it's like a global timeout. For those of you who have children, you know that sometimes they act up and you say, sit down, time out, cool out, think what you did wrong. And so the whole planet is doing this right now. So as a result, we may be able to come up with a better planetary consciousness than we've had going into the COVID situation. Of course, like after World War II, we got multilateralism. We didn't have much multilateralism before World War II. We got the United Nations, all kinds of cooperation. Nature, when it has a disaster, new stuff grows all the time. So what will grow out of a world pandemic? We've never had a world timeout before. This is new stuff. So I hope that the peace movement will take this time of rethinking everything. And I mean everything. Some speakers before were talking about economic systems. I think the whole thing should be rethought. And the faster we open up our conversations to that, the better we are. So that's all I got to say. There's only a couple people here. So if you got any questions, let me know.
I'm very interested in what you're proposing here. I think it needs to be not just China, the U.S., but all countries. But I'd be willing to start with China and the U.S. since they are.
That's exactly the idea. Is it just start with China, and then make it possible for India and other countries to come in, including corporations. You know, we'd like to have corporations involved in this sort of stuff too. By the way, I don't know if you all know this, but if you take the cash of the world, the wealth of the world all together, about 80% of that is either controlled by investment houses, financial investment houses, or managing that sort of stuff for other people. Only 20% of that, or 25%, 25% goes through nation state treasuries. So if you're going to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals and a lot of other stuff we're talking about, you really got to get the muscle of investment houses. That's one of the unsung targets of the peace movement, in my judgment. Who's on the board of directors of different investment houses, and how can they invest their money differently? So yes, we'd like to have the joint program with China with as soon as it gets going, as soon as it's agreed, immediately recruit everybody else in. Yes.
I was wondering, do you have a similar list for the US like you just had for China, the sources of instability, like the huge wealth and income gaps, and political instability with a coup a year ago and stuff? Attempted coup and stuff.
No, I haven't done that. And the only reason for that, by the way, is that since I'm in Washington, D.C. and running a global think tank, I'm very conscious that an awful lot of people don't trust the United States. So I focus so much on the rest of the world that we've finally been accepted as not a U.S. aligned think tank per se, but a humanity aligned think tank. But yeah, but you can make up a similar list of the United States very easily. By the way, one of the previous speakers says there's two existential threats, nuclear and the climate. We're working with the UN Secretary General's office, and we on strategic threats, long-term existential strategic threats, and we had a list of 10 of them. So it's just not those two. We're not that these things are going to finish us off. By the way, it's just these are things we've got to pay attention to, and we got to have research to fill the gaps what we don't know. Because there's a lot that we don't know.
You missed housing on your first list of 8. Shelter and housing.
No, I was talking about China. These are threats that have been listed by a think tank in the UK and another, the U.S. Naval Research System, whatever it was. I took out of their list, so this is not my list per se.
Oh, okay. They missed
it. Of those things, what is China in threat for?
So it's not clear to me what are the next steps you would give us.
Okay.
Direction.
Well, right. What I would do, what I have done, is to lobby a little bit. We used to do the environmental security reports for the U.S. Army, circulated to other militaries around the world. So one is to lobby a bit the Defense Department to say environmental security is a top issue, which by the way it is now. I mean, if you read these U.S. military report strategy documents, where they are saying here's our global situation, climate change is right up there with terrorism, by the way, as a threat to the United States. So we're winning on the Department of Defense side, but not yet on the State Department. The State Department has had 2 agreements already with China on environmental collaboration, but they're weak. They're basically saying we're going to share what we do. That's okay, but their spies can get that anyway. That's no big deal. But we'd like to, and they've had a couple of exchanges, tours back and forth. But we'd like to actually make it an out loud goal. So one is I would push the State Department for that. I'd have pushed the White House a little bit on it, and the military. So those would be the 3. And then, of course, you can always write op-ed articles or letters to the editor and things like that. But I would just talk it up in different circles. Like, do you think that's a good idea? By the way, aside from all what I've just said, I think it would give the world hope if the 2 mega superpowers collaborated on the mega environmental issue of the day. I mean, I think that that would give hope around the world.
Are you familiar with Professor James Anderson over at Harvard University? He's an atmospheric climate scientist, chemist who makes the same statement when he gave a warning about the short timeline for us to act collectively. If we want to address reduction in carbon, you go to the two largest entities responsible for its emission, and they make the decisions, and the rest of the world will follow. The rest of the world is already way ahead of the United States, or trying to be ahead of the United States. The US usually interferes.
Right. One of the areas where the individual, aside from lobbying, can do is keep track of the research on making meat without animals. Right now, you have, in a sense, imitation meat with vegetables, and that's better than nothing. But that's still not quite as good as making the meat with actual cell material, because you can do a Google search on FAO 2006, transportation versus livestock industry. Turned out that the overall greenhouse impact is higher with the meat industry than it is with transportation industry. And the reason for that is there's not just cow farts, because that's always been what the people who argue against these things use as, well, it's just cow farts. No, it's a lot more than cow fart. First of all, a cow, you got to, before you get the return on investment is 5 years or so. And the majority of the water that we use on the planet is for agriculture, and the majority of that water in agriculture is used for growing food for animals that we eat. So it's the entire process of that is the issue, not just cow farts. And so if we actually can shift from agricultural farm manufacturing of animal stuff, you can do this for leather. I mean, and for milk. I mean, in business, people talk about cutting out the middleman. Well, if the middleman is the animal and the end product is the food and the first part is the cell, we'll cut out the middle part, leave the animal alone. Just go straight, and then you can decentralize your production, so you don't have to put it in ships losing up oil and the rest of it. You don't have to worry about disease going across because you controlled it.
That's another form of industrialization of the world's food supply. Who would control that? We've seen U.S. corporations controlling access to vaccinations punitively, strictly for profit. And the U.S. has a long history of controlling food for profit and as a political weapon. So Vandana Shiva, you're claimed to be a globalist. You know who she is? Vandana Shiva, India?
I'm not sure. An awful lot of stuff goes in my poor little brain and out the other side all day long. So I don't know.
It's about localization is what she's working on in India.
Good.
And small scale. And the fact that ruminants are essential for converting sunlight into nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
Where do the nutrients come from for the industrial process you're advocating?
Oh, as you may know, something like 7 times the amount of pharmaceuticals go into animals, not humans.
That's industrial agriculture.
Yeah, that's right. That's the industrial agriculture. That is a gigantic industry. So all these chemicals going through the drugs going through these animals is what we're eating.
That's petroleum based.
Yeah.
Petroleum industry is interested in that.
Yep.
So Jerome, are you saying don't eat meat, or are you saying make fake meat better?
Well, what I'm saying is this is a factor. Preaching to people is not always the best effect, but I would say that the more you eat vegetarian, the better off we'll be. Not to mention your health, but I would not, jump up and down on top of people about it. Secondly, the vegetable-based meat is better than the current factory meat. But third, the cell-based meat will be the best, but that hasn't scaled up yet.
What's cell-based meat?
Okay, imagine you got some cells that you really like, some Kobe beef out of Japan, really nice cells that you're really happy with. So you clone them, and you give them. It turns out to be algae is one of the best feedstocks for it, by the way. and it looks like you're going to have to stimulate them a little bit so that they're tough enough that you can chew. So there's a bunch of processes that go along, but you're basically going from, it's just like you came out of a cell. You know, you had your father and your mother got together, made a cell, and then it started reproducing like crazy. So, and that made you. But instead of making all of you, the idea would be to make the cell produce the same meat. So you're making muscle. You're just basically growing muscle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
this idea has been around a long time. NASA realized they had to do something like this because if you're going off into space, you're not going to have a farm, you know. So where are you going to
And
get your
that's
hamburger?
different than a GMO.
Yeah, no, it's not a GMO because you haven't modified you haven't modified the
duplicate.
genetics of the cell.
They
You
were
just-
actually taking cells from the animals as
Correct.
base.
That's right.
Understood. Okay, cool.
That's right. So when people say it's fake meat, well, that you can say that about the vegetable, but you can't say that about the meat without animals, because that's not fake. As a matter of fact, that's more pure than what you get with a cow, because you get all the pharmaceuticals with a cow. So if we can do this right and scale up, it's pure meat. It's more pure meat than what we get right now.
Could we do it with human meat? I mean, my muscles?
Sure.
I mean,
But
that probably wouldn't be good to
That
do,
would
but
probably kill the idea of the cow stuff. There's all a bunch of
Yeah.
cannibals, you know? No, yeah, the answer to your question is you could, but let's not do that.
So
I don't know
Professor
what I'm
Glenn,
doing.
in order to get this cooperation on these issues, it seems to me we have to break the power of the fossil fuel industry and big ag.
Well,
Need to,
It's-
there is a
it's-
movement,
yeah, well, go ahead.
there is a movement for a new treaty against the proliferation of fossil fuels.
Well,
And
yeah.
I support that concept, even though I don't think my own government will ever ratify such a treaty, especially as long as the fossil fuel industry controls my government, which is pretty strong.
Right, yes, it's pretty strong.
It seems to me that the fossil fuel industry across the globe is very powerful.
Yeah.
I don't think we can get this international cooperation
Oh, I disagree.
without
I
changing
disagree.
the power relationship.
I disagree. I mentioned before about the investment community worldwide. There are at least two major, when I say trillions of dollars worth of investment, two major investment collectives, so to speak, or networks or associations that are trying to begin the shift on all these environmental issues. Now, that doesn't happen overnight, but the idea of people beginning to change these investment houses on what they invest into is in motion. How fast that'll go, hard to say. It is in motion. Second point I would say is really important not to give up. So, I mean, you know, I'm a great believer in the analogy of a tree. Someone says, well, how did this occur? And I go, well, you know, look at all the different roots that got to the present time. I mean, you need all kinds of approaches all together to make the tree work. I think that the willingness, I mean, as I mentioned to you, I actually wrote about climate change in early '73, so I've been involved in this scholarly shit for a long time. That the willingness of major shifts is there. As you point out, the political leadership is not. And I'm suggesting that the financial leadership is beginning to shift. And then a third one is we do have the Paris Agreement. You said the United States would never agree. Well, Biden did come back to the Paris Agreement. We haven't got yet a solid framework for a treaty beyond Paris yet. And that's got to be done. Now, one thing that did come out of the last one, everybody said it was a disaster, okay. But one thing that did come out, which I was very happy with, goes back to the meat business, is for the first time we included methane target. We didn't have that before. We said, okay, we're going to get rid of methane by 2030 or cut it in half or whatever it was. But what that does is it adds agriculture, because before we've been talking about transportation and energy. Perfectly important to talk about. Yes, yes, yes. But the other third there is agriculture. And this is the first time agriculture has been brought into the picture. And I think that's very important. And people agreed to it. So then they got to figure out, well, then how do we do that? And then all of a sudden they'll discover, oh, agriculture is a big problem here.
But what about the power of the fossil fuel industry? They're making billions of dollars, and they don't want to stop the flow of billions of dollars into their pocketbooks.
Right. Well, you got a two-step dance here. On one hand, they want to make a profit. They don't care what the hell a profit is necessarily from. If they can make a profit from something else, they'll do it. But the trouble is we keep saying, where's my car? Where's my hamburger? Where's my this? Where's my, and we still have this gigantic, you got another 2 billion people coming up in 30 years. 2 billion. 2 billion. All right. And furthermore, these people are not going to be as poor as the last 2 billion. In other words, we're because of the internet and all that sort of stuff, we're sharing out a lot of capacity to make wealth we didn't have before. So that means that the demand for things like energy, the demand for things like heat, the demand for things like meat and all that keep going up. So we, the consumers, got a big role here too. We have to change our consumer patterns, because then the businesses will say, the business will say, oh my God, the market's moving over there. I better move.
So you
Back to that,
you
can
can
I?
do this without altering the current rapacious form of capitalism?
Hear me. We need the whole kitchen sink. We need everything. Everything that you'd put on your list, I'll agree to. Plus, I'll give you some more to add to the list. We need to do everything. The entire kitchen sink. Yes, you got to go to board meetings and so forth. Yes, et cetera, et cetera. We need to do all of these things. So when people say, well, what's the most important? I say the most important is to throw that question out. You do what you can do. If you're the best at dealing with the State Department, then do that. If you're the best at dealing with consumer patterns in a newspaper, then do that. If you're the best at talking to the investment houses, then do that. We need all of it.
I want to
Jerome-
ask you a little bit about the fossil fuel thing, that sort of following up from Mary. A lot of the divestment, there's been a lot of divestment of fossil fuels by institutions. And, there's a moral aspect to it, but there's also an aspect that, their valuation is based on pumping all the oil that they have access to, but the planet can't support that. So actually some of the divestment is noticing that they're not a good investment from an economic point of view, because people, at some point they're going to be stopped or slowed down from, pumping all the oil that they're valued for. So I'm just wondering to what extent you think this can really work against the sort of the hegemony of the fossil fuel industry.
Short-term thinking.
Yeah, there is. If you do a Google, I don't have it right in front of me, but if you do a Google search, maybe Jacoba can do this while we're talking. On last name of the guy is Patel, Patel, and then put in UN Sustainable Development Goals, investment change or investment for good, and see if something comes up. There's papers where this is the stuff I was talking about before. The real money is in the investment houses of the world. I mean, governments, they're pinned down. I mean, they got all kinds of legislative and lobbying, all that sort. But where you can start to shift, if you can start to show, I can get a similar return on investment for this versus this other idiotic thing. Because as you shift the investment system of the world, you really shift the world. I would say today, because of the global capitalism and all the money flows and all that sort of stuff, I would say the real power in the world is not as much nation states as people think. I'd say it's investment houses. Imagine if 30 years ago, we invested a whole lot into solar energy. We'd be further down the road by now. I see Jeffrey's hands up. He's been patient the whole time.
Yeah, actually, Vincent and Steve are more patient.
Okay, fair enough. Good. Then
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yes, I have been to China, and I hate to cast a wet blanket here, but the social pressures within China are not going to lead China to be responsible in environmental ways. The people, there's a developing middle class because of a very effective education system. You mentioned the rich and the poor. The middle class is developing. The air links all go to Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. They have visited, they have seen those societies. They want to be like the middle class. The younger people want to be like the middle class. The collectivism that the older people have, even Maoism, Stalinism, Maoism had some good values, and one was collectivism. The young people do not have it. They want to go into the middle class, to have the trinkets that the Japanese have.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, one of the other ways you measure if you're middle class is how many times per week you can eat meat.
Right.
So the social pressures, unfortunately, will make this more of a struggle.
Well, it's definitely more of a struggle. That's why one of my first slides listed these environmental factors that are strategic threats to China. I mean, they're threats to the stability of the Communist Party. These are things that can bring down the party. So they're aware of this stuff. I mean, so out of their own self-interest of maintaining power, I think that that's where we could begin. Now, as I mentioned, we had 2 baby steps already between the U.S. and China, little baby steps on collaboration. But we got to move these baby steps into bigger steps, and it may have to be several middle class steps, so to speak, before we get to the big time.
Right.
But I understand what you're saying about China, but the environmental problems are quite real in China, as you know.
Right.
And
Unfortunately, the
leadership
government
knows
and the party would rather repress than negotiate responsibly with their own developing middle class.
I think that both can happen at the same time. I think they'll still be repressive. I think that they'll still want to, but the idea of how are they going to keep in power? I think that the environmental factors, the air pollution, the water pollution, the lack of energy situations, the water tables going down, these are gigantic problems in China. And so for them to maintain power, one of the ways that you do it is say, I'm making the right decisions, trust me. Well, the people are saying right now, when it comes to environment, you're not necessarily making the right decisions. So I think that I don't think there's a contradiction here. I think that their interest in maintaining power will be what drives them into these agreements.
Jerome, could you take off your screen share so we can see everyone?
We got hands up.
Could you take off your screen share?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, because we can see everyone. Thanks.
Okay, there we go. My apologies. My apologies.
Jerome, I'd like to ask you a question about
democracy. Hey, go ahead.
Jerome, I'd like you to ask you a question about one of the early slides where you had the bar graph of China was 28% and US is 15%. And I think in the US, we have to take more responsibility because I think the graph shows what's produced in that country, but China, Guangdong is producing as much as the whole US. And that's being produced for the global North, much of it, US and Europe and stuff. So it seems like the graph should show the greenhouse gases that come from consumption in a particular country rather than production.
Absolutely correct. There's also, they should do that with water, because the thing about, like, if you're producing something over here and you're using all that water, but you're exporting it over here, ultimately the water's going to it's the same thing. So you got to use the energy charts, you got to use the water charts. It's all true. And I would also add to that, the idea is that what is the cumulative effect over time? Because, you know, we have done a lot of evolution, not just this year, but we've done it over a period of time. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff. But the main thing is, these are the 2 powers that have got to do it, that have got to lead. Because if you look on that list, you see the UK and you see Singapore. So if Singapore and UK get together, who cares? No, not who cares. I mean, but it wouldn't matter too much. So the main point is we got to get Washington and Beijing to move forward on this.
But they're consuming more too than they produce. Yeah. Singapore is a small place, but it's
I know
it's prosperous.
I know, but the point is that it's got to be the 2 biggest, because it's the moral responsibility, but also the economics, also the engineering. You know, China is a major engineering power in the future. It is today. So they've got the money, they've got the technology, and they got the moral responsibility, as does the United States.
I don't know, Jeffrey, if you wanted to go. I know there is a question in the chat that I think is really interesting, kind of builds off our discussion. If I can just state that question.
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, so Janet is wondering, what do you think is the most helpful tactic for bringing people together to move forward on resolving these problems? Like kind of like first steps for us as activists and peace builders to foment action on this issue at the local level.
Right. Oh, that's a long laundry list. But relative to this U.S.-China thing, you can get it in your newspapers. I mean, local newspapers are monitored by the big newspapers. And sometimes there was a guy, Nesbitt or whatever his name was, used to monitor all local newspapers, and a lot of new stuff came out of local newspapers and went into the big stuff later on. So I would say, if you agree with the idea, you don't have to, you don't agree. But if you agree with the idea, you can do a simple little letter to the editor of any local newspapers saying, why not a U.S.-China goal? Why not? So that would be one. The other one is, as I mentioned before, write your senator, congressman, things are still ruled to some degree, and also send a letter to the Secretary of State. Why don't we have a U.S.-China agreement? Why not? Why not? Why not? We're saying these things are going to be done. We're given the lip service, so let's get to it.
Definitely, yeah. These are some really good points you're making for sure. We have a couple more minutes. I don't know if anyone has any other questions.
Was China the highest, Jerome, and then the U.S. underneath?
Yeah, China's the highest, but it was pointed out correctly that China does a lot of manufacturing that we and the rest of the world buy. So in a sense, we are driving, in a sense, or exporting that stuff. So that point was well taken. But if you're just measuring what goes up into the atmosphere per geographic, then they're the gigantic leader.
Right. Do you think this would be harmed if I've been pushing a lot lately because of this Ukraine thing that China and Russia should get together? Because I think in spite of the fact that you say China's at the top, I think it's USA is the hegemon of the world, or think they are. Yeah. And we need to come down,
Yeah. Well, I was just talking about environment.
Actually.
I was just talking about environmental diplomacy. If we want to talk about geopolitical, that's another conversation.
Yeah, but that affects it's all about economics, right? Like you said.
Not according to Putin. According to Putin, it's all about power, because his economic system is a junkyard.
No, but it's all about economics of what it's cheaper to do things environmentally correct. A lot cheaper.
Yeah, I get. Oh my goodness gracious! I can unplug my Alexa here. It started to come in with an answer.
Alexa joined the conversation.
Alexa said, "I got a better answer than you humans," Anyway, I guess I'm not getting your point. I don't see pushing Russia on climate change. I just, it would be nice, but I just figure, that kind of matter.
No, I'm saying pushing China and Russia to join together, would that harm this situation? Because I think China and Russia need to join together because the U.S. is just suddenly become a behemoth. The whole country is just demonizing Russia all of a sudden, and it's going to come to a head if we don't. I mean, although we have no first strike, Russia will strike, and we'll be just the whole world will be nuked.
Right.
So just averting imminent disaster.
As I said, the geopolitics is a different game altogether. If I look at when you talk about environment, we're talking about a long sweep of history here. Russia will be a pimple in that, frankly. China will not be a pimple in that. And
what I wondered is if that would be adverse to your proposal.
Oh, I mean, heck, if they collaborated on environment, that'd be great. I mean, they got some horrible environmental problems in Russia. I think it would be great.
And what I meant is if they collaborate together against the U.S. on Ukraine, because that's
guys.
where all the money's
Okay.
going now.
Thank you very much. This is
Guys,
great.
I'm so sorry. I just want to say thank you so much, Mr. Glenn. We have 5 seconds before we're going to be kicked out, but